My parents knocked on my apartment door after years of barely caring about my life. Not to apologize, not to reconnect. They came to ask me for $75,000 for my younger sister Sophie's wedding. The same parents who refused to help me pay for college. The same parents who watched me work 3 jobs, survive on instant noodles, and walk through freezing Wisconsin winters in shoes with holes in the soles because struggle builds character. Now suddenly, my money mattered. My mother sat on my gray sofa, smiling like we were one big happy family again, while my father calmly explained that Sophie's wedding needed to meet a certain standard because her fiancé came from a wealthy family. Then my father looked me dead in the eye and said the sentence that changed everything. Family takes care of family, Claire. It's your duty to help. Duty. That word hit me like a slap. Because when I was 18 years old, terrified and holding my university acceptance letter and shaking hands, they told me debt was shameful and that if I wanted an education, I needed to learn resilience by doing it alone. And I did. I survived 4 brutal years without them. I built my life without them. But now they wanted to spend my hard-earned security on flowers, champagne, and a ballroom wedding for the daughter they actually loved. Something inside me cracked open that day. Not weakness, not heartbreak, clarity. And before this was over, my family was going to learn something they had never expected from the quiet daughter they ignored. I was finally done sacrificing myself for people who only loved me when I was useful. My name is Claire Holloway. I am 28 years old, and I live in Madison. Most people would probably say I have a good life. I work as a senior cybersecurity analyst for a large financial security company downtown. I own a reliable car, rent a modern apartment with huge windows overlooking the city, and have enough money in my savings account to finally sleep peacefully at night. But peace is a strange thing when you grow up in a house where love was conditional. The knock on my apartment door came on a cold Saturday morning in November. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had spent the morning drinking coffee on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket while reading emails from work. The city below looked gray and sleepy beneath the clouds. Then came the knock. 3 sharp hits against the wood. I frowned and walked to the door barefoot. The moment I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. My parents, Richard and Diane Holloway, stood in the hallway dressed like they were heading to church instead of ambushing their oldest daughter after months of silence. My mother smiled the second I opened the door. "Claire," she said brightly, stepping forward before I could react. "You look wonderful." My father gave me a stiff nod. "Can we come in?" Every instinct told me to say no. Instead, years of conditioning made me step aside, automatically. They walked into my apartment slowly, looking around with open curiosity. My mother touched the back of my gray sofa, while my father glanced toward the kitchen island and floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt less like parents visiting their daughter, and more like investors inspecting property. "You've done well for yourself," Dad said. "Thanks," I answered quietly. Nobody asked if I was happy. Nobody asked how work was going. Nobody asked anything about me at all. Mom sat down first and folded her hands in her lap. Then she smiled again. The smile looked rehearsed. "Claire," she said softly, "we need a favor." I felt my chest tighten immediately. Dad leaned forward. "It's about Sophie's wedding." Of course it was. Everything in our family had always been about Sophie. Even when we were children, my younger sister moved through the world like sunlight bending toward her automatically. Teachers adored her. Neighbors complimented her constantly. My parents built their entire emotional universe around her happiness. And me? I was dependable, quiet, responsible, invisible. Mom reached across the sofa and grabbed my hand. Her palm felt cold. "The wedding needs to be perfect," she said carefully. "Nathan's family is very wealthy, and there are expectations." Dad cleared his throat. "We need $75,000. The room went silent. I stared at them, honestly convinced for one insane second that I had misunderstood the number. $75,000 for a wedding. My wedding gift from my parents when I graduated college had been a card with $20 inside. I wish I could say my parents' request shocked me completely, but the truth was, some part of me had always known this moment would come, because in our family, Sophie was loved. I was useful. There's a difference. Sophie was 2 years younger than me, but from the moment she was born, it felt like the world tilted in her direction. She had bright blonde hair, huge blue eyes, and a smile that made people forgive her before she even made mistakes. Meanwhile, I was the serious child, the quiet one, the one adults described as mature for her age, which is usually just another way of saying a child learned early not to expect comfort. I remember my 10th birthday better than most holidays. I had invited 4 girls from school over for cake and movies. Nothing expensive. Nothing dramatic. I spent the entire week cleaning the house and helping Mom cook because I wanted everything to go perfectly. That morning, Sophie woke up with a tiny cough, not a fever. Not the flu, a cough. Mom immediately rushed into panic mode. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, sitting beside Sophie on the couch. "You don't look well at all." "I'm okay," Sophie sniffled dramatically. Dad folded his newspaper and frowned. "We can't have a bunch of noisy children running around while your sister is sick." I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. "But it's my birthday," I said quietly. Mom barely looked at me. "We'll celebrate another time." Another time never came. My friends never showed up because Mom canceled everything an hour before the party. That night, we ate takeout while Sophie picked the movie and curled up between my parents on the sofa like a tiny queen surrounded by loyal servants. Nobody sang happy birthday. Nobody even mentioned it again. I went to bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling, trying to understand why I felt so empty over something so small. Years later, I realized it wasn't about the party. It was about learning my feelings ranked last in the house I lived in. The pattern only got worse as we grew older. I got straight A's without anyone checking homework or attending school events. My report cards were treated like expected maintenance on a car. Good grades weren't celebrated. They were required. Meanwhile, Sophie getting a C on a history test triggered emergency family meetings. "She's trying her best," Mom would insist while sitting beside Sophie at the kitchen table, helping with homework for hours. Dad hired tutors. They bought motivational gifts. They praised every tiny accomplishment like she had cured cancer. One Christmas, when I was 16, I finally let myself hope things might feel different. I had spent months talking about how much I loved drawing. I dreamed about becoming an illustrator before I discovered cybersecurity. I wanted professional art supplies more than anything in the world. Christmas morning arrived. Sophie sat in front of a mountain of presents, wearing silk pajamas Mom bought specifically for holiday photos. She opened designer clothes, concert tickets, expensive makeup, and the newest phone model. Then Dad handed me one flat rectangular box. My heart jumped. Maybe they had listened. Maybe they had seen me for once. I tore the paper open carefully. Inside were SAT prep books, advanced calculus workbooks, a college admissions guide. Dad smiled proudly. "We know how focused you are on your future, Claire." Mom nodded approvingly. Practical gifts are better than childish hobbies. I stared down at the textbooks, while Sophie squealed over diamond earrings from her aunt. Something inside me quietly shut down that morning. Not dramatically, not loudly, just permanently. After that, I stopped telling my parents things. I stopped mentioning my drawings, stopped talking about boys I liked, stopped explaining my dreams. I became easy, efficient, emotionally self-contained, exactly the kind of daughter they preferred. And by the time I received my acceptance letter from University of Wisconsin-Madison, I already knew one painful truth. If I wanted a future, I would probably have to build it alone. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early January. Snow covered the sidewalks outside our house in the Madison suburbs. An icy wind rattled the windows while I stood at the mailbox staring at the envelope in my trembling hands. I had gotten in, not just into college, into one of the best cybersecurity programs in the country, at University of Wisconsin-Madison. For a moment, I felt something dangerous bloom inside my chest. Hope. Real hope. I ran inside the house, clutching the envelope so tightly the paper bent at the corners. Mom stood in the kitchen helping Sophie paint her nails at the counter, while Dad read financial news on his tablet. "Nathan texted me again," Sophie giggled. "He said I'm the prettiest girl at school." "That's because you are," Mom smiled. I stood there awkwardly, waiting for someone to notice me. Finally, Dad glanced up. "What is it, Claire?" "I got in," I blurted out breathlessly. "The cybersecurity program. I got accepted." For 1 second, silence filled the kitchen. I waited for excitement, for pride, for anything. Mom smiled politely. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey." Then she turned back to Sophie's nails. Dad nodded once. "Good job." That was it. I swallowed hard and forced myself to continue. "There's a tuition deposit due next week," I said carefully. "I already applied for financial aid, but I still need help covering some of the cost. I was hoping maybe you could co-sign a student loan. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Dad slowly lowered his tablet. Mom's smile disappeared. Sophie stopped painting her nails. Dad leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. No, he said flatly. The word hit me so hard, I actually blinked. I'm not asking you to pay everything, I explained quickly. I just need a cosigner. I'll make the payments myself. We are not attaching our names to debt, Dad replied calmly. Debt is shameful. I stared at him in disbelief. You bought Sophie a car last month. That's different, Mom snapped immediately. Sophie needs reliable transportation. Sophie wanted a Jeep, I said before I could stop myself. Mom's face hardened. And you want an expensive degree. It's not expensive just because I want it, I whispered. It's my future. Dad stood slowly from the table. You're young, Claire. You need to learn resilience. Struggle builds character. If we make life too easy for you, you'll become dependent. I honestly thought I might laugh from the absurdity. Dependent? I had been emotionally raising myself for years. I worked for this, I said, tears filling my eyes. I did everything right. And you'll continue doing things right, Dad answered, without handouts. The rage building in my chest felt hot and terrifying. You're seriously refusing to help me? We are helping you, Mom insisted. We're teaching you responsibility. I looked at Sophie sitting silently beside her new car keys on the kitchen counter. Then I looked back at my parents. For the first time in my life, I saw them clearly. Not misunderstood. Not strict. Not tough. Selfish. I can't believe this, I whispered. Dad sighed like I was exhausting him. You're being emotional. I grabbed my coat and walked out before they could say another word. Snow hit my face immediately. I walked 3 miles through freezing wind to Rosewood Cottage. By the time Grandma Rose opened the front door, my cheeks were numb and tears were frozen against my skin. She took one look at me and pulled me inside without asking questions. Grandpa Walter sat quietly at the kitchen table while I cried so hard I could barely breathe. They won't help me, I choked out. They won't even sign the paperwork. Grandpa exchanged a long look with Grandma. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook. How much is the deposit? He asked softly. I stared at him. Grandpa, no! We can't pay your tuition, Grandma said gently, squeezing my hand. But you are not losing your future because your parents forgot how to love properly. That night, lying awake in the small guest room surrounded by Grandma's sewing supplies and old family quilts, I made a decision. If I had to survive alone, then I would survive so completely that nobody could ever control me again. The next 4 years of my life blurred together into exhaustion. Not dramatic movie exhaustion, real exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones until you forget what feeling rested even means. I moved into the tiny spare bedroom at Rosewood Cottage 2 weeks before classes started. The room barely fit a twin bed, an old wooden desk, and Grandma Rose's stacked sewing boxes, but it became the safest place I had ever lived. For the first time in my life, home didn't feel conditional. Grandma taped encouraging notes beside my mirror before exams. Grandpa Walter waited up at night when I worked late shifts. Nobody treated me like a burden. That alone felt life-changing. Still, survival came with a price. I worked 3 jobs while attending school full-time at University of Wisconsin-Madison. From 4 in the morning until 8, I stocked shelves at a grocery store on the edge of town. Then I rushed across campus for classes that lasted until afternoon. In the evenings, I worked as a waitress at a diner near the interstate where truck drivers drank coffee until midnight. On weekends, I cleaned office buildings downtown. Every day felt identical. Wake up tired. Work tired, study tired, cry tired. Repeat. There were nights I fell asleep sitting upright at my desk with coding textbooks open across my lap. Nights my fingers cramped from typing, while my feet blistered from waitressing double shifts. But every tuition payment I made felt like reclaiming ownership over my own future. My parents rarely called, and when they did, conversations somehow always became about Sophie. Sophie made varsity cheerleading, Mom said once, while I ate dry cereal for dinner after a 12-hour shift. Another time, Dad spent 20 straight minutes talking about Sophie's new boyfriend, while I sat outside in freezing rain waiting for a delayed bus after class. Neither of them noticed I had stopped telling them things entirely. Then came the winter I almost broke. Madison winters are brutal, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you inhale. One January evening, heavy snow buried the sidewalks while I walked toward the bus stop after my diner shift. My sneakers had holes worn through the soles from overuse, and icy water seeped inside with every step. I was shaking violently by the time I reached the corner. Then headlights appeared through the snow. A white SUV slowed beside the intersection, Sophie's Jeep. Music blasted from inside while warm yellow light glowed through the windows. Sophie sat laughing with two friends in the back seat, her hair perfectly curled, expensive coat wrapped around her shoulders. For one stupid second, hope flared inside me. Maybe she'd stop. Maybe she'd finally see me. Instead, the SUV sped through a slushy puddle beside the curb. Freezing gray water splashed across my jeans and coat. The car kept driving. Nobody looked back. I stood there, soaked in the snow, staring after the taillights until they disappeared. Something hardened inside me permanently that night. Not hatred. Not jealousy. Detachment. I stopped expecting kindness from my family after that. And strangely, life became easier once I accepted I was truly alone. 4 years later, I graduated magna cum laude, near the top of my cybersecurity program. Grandma cried through the entire ceremony. Grandpa Walter clapped harder than anyone in the auditorium, despite arthritis twisting his hands. My parents came too. Dad wore an expensive gray suit. Mom spent more time adjusting Sophie's hair for photos than speaking to me directly. After the ceremony, Dad shook my hand like I was a business associate instead of his daughter. "See?" he said proudly. "We knew you could do it without handouts." I stared at him in disbelief. He actually believed their neglect had been wisdom. Mom smiled beside him. "We made you strong." No, they made me lonely. There's a difference. That night, while everyone celebrated at restaurants downtown, I sat alone on the porch at Rosewood Cottage, watching snow fall beneath the streetlights. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that belonged entirely to me. My first paycheck as a cybersecurity analyst felt unreal. I remember sitting inside my car in the parking garage beneath the office building in Madison, staring at the number on my banking app while my hand trembled against the steering wheel. For years, every dollar in my account had represented survival. Rent, tuition, bus fare, groceries. Now, for the first time in my life, the money represented something else. Safety. I cried in that parking garage for almost 10 minutes before pulling myself together. Then I drove straight to Rosewood Cottage and took Grandma Rose and Grandpa Walter out for the fanciest dinner I could afford. Grandpa kept staring at the steak on his plate like someone might take it away from him. "This place charges $18 for mashed potatoes," he whispered to me in horror. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my water. Grandma squeezed my hand across the table. "We're proud of you, Evie." Those words healed something inside me that I didn't realize was still bleeding. Within a year, I moved into my own apartment downtown. It wasn't enormous, but to me, it felt luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors, a quiet bedroom with soft lighting, a refrigerator full of actual food instead of instant noodles and diner leftovers. The first thing I bought wasn't expensive furniture or electronics. It was art supplies, professional watercolor paints, sketchbooks, brushes. For years, I had buried the parts of myself that felt soft, because softness had never survived well in my parents' house. Now I started painting again late at night after work, while jazz music played quietly in the background. I slowly began building a life that felt peaceful instead of painful. But the dynamic with my family never changed. If anything, it became worse. Now that I had money, my parents treated my success like a permanent solution to every problem. They assumed I was fine because I handled things quietly. Meanwhile, Sophie drifted from dream to dream while they financed every failure. First, she dropped out of college after one semester because classes were too overwhelming. Mom cried about the pressure Sophie was under, while Dad paid the withdrawal fees without complaint. Then Sophie decided she wanted to attend cosmetology school. 3 months later, she quit that too. "She's just finding herself," Mom explained constantly. After that came photography. Then social media influencing. Then lifestyle blogging. Dad bought cameras. Mom bought lighting equipment. Nobody ever asked how many hours I worked each week to afford my own survival. One Sunday dinner still burned vividly in my memory. I had just received a major promotion at work. Senior cybersecurity analyst. The youngest person on my team to reach the position. I actually arrived at the Holloway family home excited for once. "I got promoted," I announced during dinner. Dad barely looked up from carving roast beef. "That's nice." Mom reached for the salad bowl. "Sophie met someone." Of course she had. Immediately, the entire table shifted focus. Mom's eyes sparkled with excitement. "His name is Nathan Mercer," she gushed. His family owns luxury hotels across the Midwest. Sophie smiled smugly into her wine glass. He drives a Porsche. Dad looked genuinely impressed for the first time all evening. Well, that's serious money. I sat there silently, gripping my fork while they discussed Nathan's family, vacations, business connections, an expensive lifestyle for nearly an hour. Nobody asked about my promotion again, not once. Driving home that night through downtown Madison, I realized something painful but freeing. Nothing I achieved would ever impress them as much as Sophie simply being desired by wealthy people. I was the dependable daughter, the practical daughter, the daughter who survived quietly. Sophie was the exciting daughter, the beautiful daughter, the daughter they could proudly display. So I stopped trying. I visited less frequently after that. I focused on work, on painting, on hiking trails outside the city, on building friendships with people who actually saw me. Eventually, my apartment became my sanctuary, a quiet place untouched by guilt or comparison. I truly believed I had escaped the emotional gravity of my family. Then came the knock on my apartment door that cold November morning, and suddenly, after years of barely noticing me at all, my parents remembered I existed because they needed $75,000. I honestly thought I had misheard them. $75,000 sounded less like a request and more like the kind of number people joked about online when talking about celebrity weddings. But my parents sat calmly on my gray sofa, like this was perfectly reasonable. Dad folded his hands together. The venue alone is nearly $30,000, he explained. Nathan's family has certain expectations. Mom nodded quickly. It has to look elegant, Claire. Sophie's wedding reflects on all of us. All of us. The words made my stomach twist. I stood near the kitchen island, staring at them, while memories crashed through my head in painful flashes. Me eating peanut butter with a spoon because I couldn't afford bread in college. Me cleaning office bathrooms at midnight before exams. Me walking through snow and broken shoes, while Sophie drove past in a heated SUV. And now they wanted my savings for flower arrangements and champagne towers. You're serious? I said quietly. Dad frowned. Of course we're serious. You want me to spend $75,000 on a party. It's not just a party, Mom snapped. It's Sophie's wedding, as if that explained everything. Dad leaned forward slightly. We're contributing what we can, but the market hasn't been favorable this year. Some of our assets are tied up. I almost laughed. Assets. That was how my father spoke about money. Cold. Precise. Detached. When I was 18, he called student loans irresponsible debt. Now suddenly financial strain justified asking his daughter for enough money to change someone's life. I don't understand, I said slowly. Why can't Nathan's family help? Mom immediately stiffened. We can't look dependent on them. Dependent. Another word that only mattered when it applied to me. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest. So instead you depend on me. That's different, Dad said sharply. How? Because your family. The hypocrisy was so breathtaking, I actually felt dizzy for a second. Family. That word again. Where exactly had family been when I cried myself to sleep over tuition bills? Where had family been when Grandma Rose secretly slipped grocery money into my backpack because she noticed I was losing weight? Where had family been when I graduated exhausted and broken after 4 years of surviving completely alone? My throat tightened painfully. I built that savings account myself, I whispered. Dad sighed impatiently. And we're proud of you for that. No. They were proud of what my money could do for them now. Mom softened her voice suddenly, slipping into the manipulative sweetness I remembered from childhood. Sophie really looks up to you, Claire. I almost choked. She barely talks to me. That's not true, Mom insisted quickly. She wants you as maid of honor. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. She wants me standing next to her because I'm paying for the wedding. Mom gasped dramatically. How can you say something so cruel? Cruel. Interesting choice of word from the woman who once canceled my birthday because Sophie had a cough. Dad stood slowly from the sofa. You're being selfish. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Not because I believed it, because I realized they truly did. In their minds, my entire purpose in the family was sacrifice. Sophie received. Claire provided. That was the system. That had always been the system. You told me struggle builds character, I said quietly. Dad frowned. What does that have to do with anything? You refused to co-sign my student loans because you said suffering would make me stronger. My voice shook now. So why doesn't Sophie need suffering? Why doesn't she need resilience? Mom immediately looked offended. Sophie is sensitive. I stared at her in disbelief. And what was I? Neither of them answered. Because they didn't know. They had spent so many years treating me like a machine that they genuinely forgot I was human. The silence stretched painfully between us. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. We need an answer by Friday. Not even a request anymore. A deadline. Like my refusal would simply be an administrative inconvenience. Something inside me snapped coldly into place. Not anger. Clarity. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. Mom blinked. What are you doing? I need you to leave. Dad's expression darkened immediately. Don't be dramatic. I'm serious. My voice came out frighteningly calm. Get out of my apartment. Mom stood slowly. Claire. Out. The word cracked through the room like glass breaking. For the first time in my life, both of my parents looked genuinely startled by me. Good. They gathered their coats in stiff silence. At the doorway, Dad turned toward me one final time. Don't disappoint this family, he warned coldly. Then they left. The second the elevator doors closed, my knees nearly gave out beneath me. I slid down against the wall, staring at my spotless apartment through blurry eyes. They wanted to take this from me too. My safety, my peace, my future. And suddenly, there was only one place in the world I wanted to be. Rosewood Cottage. The drive to Rosewood Cottage felt longer than usual that night. Street lights blurred past my windshield, while my father's words echoed endlessly in my head. Don't disappoint this family. The irony almost made me laugh. I had spent my entire life trying not to disappoint them. Straight A's, scholarships, 3 jobs, a successful career, independence, responsibility, and somehow none of it had ever been enough. Because the role they created for me was impossible from the beginning. Sophie was supposed to be loved. I was supposed to earn love. There's no winning a game designed that way. When I walked into Rosewood Cottage, Grandma Rose immediately looked up from the kitchen table and frowned. Oh, sweetheart, that was all it took. I broke. I cried harder than I had in years, sitting at their tiny kitchen table while Grandpa Walter silently pushed a mug of tea toward me. They want $75,000, I whispered finally. Grandma nearly dropped her spoon. For what? Sophie's wedding. Grandpa blinked slowly. $75,000? They said it's family duty. The disgust on Grandpa's face surprised me. Raising children is not an investment account, he said firmly. Parents aren't owed repayment for basic love. I stared down into my tea. I still feel guilty. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Because they trained you to feel guilty every time you prioritized yourself. That sentence hit something deep inside me. For years, I thought guilt meant I was selfish. But maybe guilt was simply what happened when someone raised you to believe your needs mattered least. I stayed at the cottage until almost midnight, talking quietly with my grandparents while snow drifted outside the windows. And somewhere during those hours, my fear slowly transformed into certainty. By the time Friday arrived, I already knew my answer. No. The morning of the deadline, I cleaned my apartment obsessively. Counters, floors, windows. I needed everything spotless, controlled. I think part of me wanted physical order, because emotionally, I felt like I was preparing for war. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. My parents stood outside, dressed like they were attending a business meeting. Dad carried a leather folder beneath one arm. Of course he did. I opened the door slowly. Claire, Dad said briskly, we need to finalize things today. No hello. No warmth. Straight to the transaction. They walked into my apartment confidently, like my refusal earlier that week had merely been temporary emotional instability. Dad placed the leather folder carefully onto my coffee table. The venue contracts, he explained. The first major payment is due this afternoon. I stayed standing. I'm not paying. The words landed heavily in the room. Mom blinked rapidly. Dad frowned like he genuinely hadn't understood me. What? I said no. Silence. Then Mom laughed nervously. Claire, stop being dramatic. I'm serious. Dad's jaw tightened instantly. You cannot be serious after everything we discussed. Actually, I replied calmly, this is the first time anyone in this family has taken me seriously. Mom's expression hardened. This bitterness is ugly. Bitterness. Another interesting word. Funny how daughters become bitter the second they stop sacrificing themselves quietly. Dad stepped closer toward me. This family has given you everything. Something inside me snapped. Everything? I repeated sharply. You refused to help me go to college. We taught you resilience. You abandoned me. Dad's face turned red immediately. That is ridiculous. No, I said louder now. What's ridiculous is asking me for $75,000 for flowers and champagne after refusing to co-sign a student loan. Sophie's situation is different, Mom argued desperately. Why? She's sensitive. I laughed coldly. And I wasn't? Neither of them answered again, because the truth sounded terrible out loud. Dad pointed toward me angrily. You've always been jealous of your sister. The accusation stung, even though I expected it. Jealous. Not exhausted. Not neglected. Not hurt. Jealous. I'm not jealous of Sophie, I said quietly. I'm angry at both of you. Mom folded her arms tightly. If you refuse to help this family, don't expect to remain part of it. There it was. The threat. The same weapon they had used my entire childhood. Love withdrawn as punishment. Approval exchanged for obedience. But suddenly, something incredible happened. I realized I wasn't scared anymore. I looked around my apartment. My furniture, my career, my stability, my peace. I built all of it myself. What exactly could they take from me now? You know what? I said softly. If the price of being loved by this family is $75,000, then you can keep the love. Mom gasped. Dad looked genuinely stunned. You don't mean that. I do. Dad's voice lowered dangerously. You'll regret this. I walked to the front door and opened it. Goodbye. Neither of them moved immediately. Then suddenly, a quiet voice spoke behind them from the hallway. She's right. All three of us turned, and there stood Sophie. For a moment, nobody moved. Sophie stood at the end of the hallway, wearing oversized sweatpants and an old sweatshirt I didn't recognize. Her blonde hair was twisted into a messy knot, and her mascara had smudged beneath swollen eyes. She looked nothing like the polished, glowing girl my parents usually presented to the world. She looked exhausted. Mom recovered first. Oh, honey, she rushed forward immediately, voice dripping with concern. You shouldn't be driving alone right now. You sounded emotional on the phone. Sophie stepped backward before Mom could touch her. No. The word was quiet, but it stopped everyone cold. Dad frowned. Sophie, sweetheart, your sister's upset. We're handling it. No, Sophie repeated, louder this time. You're not handling anything. I heard everything. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut skin. Mom forced a nervous laugh. You misunderstood. I didn't misunderstand, Sophie snapped suddenly. I almost flinched. I had never heard her raise her voice before. You threatened to cut Claire off because she wouldn't pay for my wedding. Dad's expression darkened instantly. We are trying to protect this family's reputation, Sophie laughed bitterly. That's the problem. You care more about appearances than people. Mom looked horrified. Sophie. No, Mom, stop. Her entire body trembled now, but she kept going anyway. I never wanted this giant wedding. Dad stared at her in disbelief. What? I said I never wanted it. Tears filled her eyes again. You wanted it. You wanted the ballroom and the expensive flowers and the perfect pictures. Mom's face crumpled. We only wanted the best for you. No, Sophie whispered painfully. You wanted the best version of me to show other people. The room went completely silent. Even my father looked shaken. Sophie wiped her face angrily. Nathan hates all of this, she admitted. We've been fighting for weeks because everything feels fake. Dad stepped forward. You can't cancel the wedding now. Why not? Because people are expecting. I don't care! Her voice cracked loudly through the apartment. For the first time in my life, Sophie looked genuinely furious instead of fragile. Then she turned toward me, and suddenly her expression broke completely. I saw you that day, she whispered. I frowned slightly. What day? The bus stop. My stomach tightened instantly. The snowstorm, Sophie continued shakily. When I drove past you, the memory hit me like ice water. She looked down at the floor. I saw how cold you were. I couldn't speak. I wanted to stop, she whispered. I swear I did. My chest hurt suddenly. Then why didn't you? Sophie's eyes filled with tears again. Because if I stopped, her voice cracked, then I'd have to admit what they were doing to you was wrong. Mom gasped softly. Dad looked furious. But Sophie kept talking. And if I admitted that, then I'd have to admit I benefited from it. The honesty in her voice stunned me silent. For years I imagined Sophie as cruel, spoiled, careless. But standing there now, she just looked deeply ashamed. I've hated myself for that moment for years, she whispered. I turned up the music because I didn't want to think about it. I felt something inside me begin to loosen painfully. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Sophie laughed bitterly through her tears. You know the worst part? She asked quietly. I was jealous of you. I stared at her. What? You were real, Claire. She shook her head slowly. You built an actual life. You survived things. You mattered outside this family. Her voice became smaller. I don't even know who I am without Mom and Dad making decisions for me. Mom burst into tears. That's not true. Yes, it is, Sophie interrupted sharply. You never let me fail. You never let me struggle. You rescued me from everything until I became completely helpless. Dad's face hardened. We gave you opportunities. You gave me dependency. That sentence hit the room like shattered glass. Then Sophie took a deep breath and looked directly at me. I'm canceling the wedding. Mom looked horrified. You can't. I can. The deposits, I don't care. Dad's jaw clenched tightly. If you walk away from this wedding, don't expect financial help from us anymore. Sophie laughed weakly. Maybe that's exactly what I need. Then she looked at me carefully. Claire, her voice softened. I know I don't deserve it, but can I come inside? I looked at my sister standing in my hallway, trembling with fear, while our parents stared at her like she had betrayed them. For the first time in our lives, Sophie wasn't standing beside them. She was standing alone, just like I had. And suddenly I understood something important. Neither of us had escaped our parents unharmed. We were just wounded differently. Slowly, I stepped aside from the doorway. Yes, I said quietly. Then I looked directly at my parents. You need to leave. Now. And this time, when the elevator doors finally closed behind them, neither Sophie nor I cried. The first night Sophie stayed at my apartment, neither of us slept much. We sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by cold takeout containers, while the city lights glowed softly through the windows. For hours we talked. Really talked. Not like sisters forced into the same house. Not like competitors fighting for scraps of parental affection. Like two exhausted people finally telling the truth. I don't even know how to pay my own phone bill, Sophie admitted quietly, sometime after midnight. I blinked at her. You're serious? She nodded miserably. Dad always handled everything. I leaned back against the couch, trying to process that. At 26 years old, my sister had never learned basic survival, because our parents made sure she never had to. Meanwhile, I knew how to survive on $14 for an entire week. The imbalance suddenly felt tragic instead of infuriating. What about Nathan? I asked carefully. Sophie's expression softened immediately. He's good, she whispered. He's honestly the only reason I started realizing how unhealthy everything was. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He kept asking why my parents controlled every decision. She gave a weak laugh. At first I defended them. Then one day he asked me something awful. What? She looked down at her hands. He asked if I was actually happy or just obedient. The silence that followed felt heavy because I already knew the answer. Over the next 3 weeks, everything changed. Sophie canceled the ballroom, canceled the designer florist, canceled the live orchestra, canceled the 6-tier wedding cake Mom had become obsessed with. Dad lost thousands in deposits. He called constantly, screaming voicemail messages that neither of us answered. Mom sent dramatic texts about humiliation and ruined reputations. Sophie stopped responding completely after the first week. Instead, we planned a different wedding together, a real wedding. We rented Maple Grove Community Hall for $200. The building looked painfully ordinary at first glance. Beige walls, linoleum floors, metal folding chairs. But somehow, none of that mattered. Every evening after work, Sophie came over to my apartment carrying cheap craft supplies and grocery store wine. We made decorations by hand, sitting barefoot on my living room floor. Paper flowers from old books, string lights around the windows, handwritten table cards. For the first time in our lives, we were building something together instead of being divided against each other. And slowly, unbelievably, we became sisters. Real sisters. Not roles, not labels, not the successful one and the pretty one. Just Claire and Sophie. One night, while we glued paper flowers together, Sophie suddenly looked up at me. Do you hate me? The question hurt more than I expected. No, I answered honestly. You should. I shook my head slowly. I think we were both children trying to survive the same house in different ways. Sophie started crying quietly after that. So did I. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and cold. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Maple Grove Community Hall while volunteers arranged folding chairs and pizza boxes filled the kitchen. And somehow, it was beautiful. Not expensive, not elegant, but alive. Grandma Rose wore a pale blue dress and a ridiculous hat covered in fake flowers. Grandpa Walter sat proudly in his wheelchair near the front row, wearing the same dark suit from my graduation. Nathan's family arrived carrying homemade food and helping move tables without a single complaint. His father rolled up his sleeves to hang decorations. His mother hugged Sophie so tightly she nearly cried again. Nobody cared about luxury. Nobody cared about appearances. They cared about love. That was it. Sophie wore a simple white dress from a vintage shop downtown that cost less than one of Mom's handbags, and she looked happier than I had ever seen her. When the ceremony started, I stood beside her as maid of honor, holding a bouquet of paper flowers we made ourselves. Nathan looked at her like she was the only person in existence. Not a trophy, not an image, a person. And suddenly I realized neither of us had ever truly witnessed healthy love before. During the vows, Sophie's voice trembled slightly. "I promise to build a real life with you," she whispered. "Even when life gets messy or hard." Nathan smiled softly. "That's the only kind of life worth having." I felt tears burning behind my eyes because Sophie was finally growing into herself. Not the version our parents created, her real self. Later that night, we danced badly beneath cheap string lights while children ran across the linoleum floors and people laughed over pizza and beer. At one point, Sophie grabbed my hand while music blasted from a tiny speaker. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" She laughed through tears. "For not writing the check." Life changed quietly after the wedding. Not dramatically, not all at once. Healing, I learned, rarely arrives like fireworks. It arrives slowly, in ordinary moments that no longer hurt. 2 months after the wedding, Sophie and Nathan moved into a tiny studio apartment on the east side of Madison. The apartment was cramped. The kitchen barely fit 2 people at once, and the radiator made strange, clanking noises every night. But Sophie adored it because it was theirs, not our parents'. The first time I visited, she proudly showed me a stack of utility bills clipped neatly to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a cat. "I paid those myself," she announced proudly. I smiled. "I know." She found a job as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic nearby. The pay wasn't impressive, but she loved working with animals, and every Friday she texted me a photo of her paycheck like it was a trophy. Maybe it was. For someone raised to depend entirely on others, independence feels revolutionary. As for me, life finally became peaceful. Not perfect, peaceful. There's a difference. I worked hard, painted more often, visited Grandma Rose and Grandpa Walter every Sunday, and slowly stopped carrying constant anger inside my chest. The anger had exhausted me for years. Eventually, I realized something strange. Once I stopped trying to earn my parents' love, their power over me disappeared. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed during work. "Dad?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering the text. "We need to talk. Capitol Square Coffee House, 5 p.m. No greeting. No apology." Classic Richard Holloway. Old fear still flickered instinctively in my stomach, but it no longer controlled me. At 5 o'clock sharp, I walked into Capitol Square Coffee House and immediately spotted them sitting near the back window. For the first time in my life, my parents looked smaller than I remembered. Dad's expensive suit hung loosely from his frame. Mom's makeup couldn't fully hide the exhaustion around her eyes. And strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction seeing it, just sadness. I sat down across from them quietly. Mom twisted a napkin nervously between her fingers. "We saw the wedding pictures online," she said softly. "It looked nice." Nice. Not embarrassing, not disgraceful. Nice. I almost smiled. Dad stared out the window before speaking. "We missed it." "You chose to miss it," I corrected calmly. Neither of them argued. That alone shocked me. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Dad sighed heavily. "We thought if we held firm, Sophie would come back." I leaned back slightly. "She did come back," I said quietly. "Just not to the version of family you wanted." Mom's eyes filled with tears immediately. "We only wanted the best for both of you." "No," I answered gently. "You wanted control. There's a difference." Dad flinched slightly at that. I continued before either of them could interrupt. "You loved Sophie by protecting her from consequences. You loved me by withholding support. Neither of those things were healthy. Mom began crying softly. We didn't know how badly we hurt you. Part of me wanted to unload years of pain onto them right there in the coffee shop. But honestly, I was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of old wounds. I'm not interested in revenge, I said quietly. I just need things to change. Dad finally looked directly at me. What does that mean? It means no more money conversations. Ever. They stayed silent. It means no more comparing Sophie and me. Mom nodded weakly. It means if you want relationships with us, you treat us like adults instead of extensions of yourselves. Dad looked uncomfortable hearing that. Good. Some truths should feel uncomfortable. And if we fail? He asked carefully. I took a slow breath. Then Sophie and I walk away. The words settled heavily across the table. Not a threat. A boundary. For the first time, my parents understood the difference. Mom wiped her eyes shakily. We just want our family back. I studied them carefully before answering. Then build one based on respect instead of obligation. Silence again. But this time, it felt different. Not hostile. Reflective. I stood slowly and grabbed my coat. I have dinner plans. Mom looked up hopefully. With Sophie? Yes. Tell her... Dad hesitated awkwardly. Tell her we said hello. I nodded once. Then I walked out into the cold Madison evening. The sunset painted the skyline gold and orange while wind curled around the sidewalks. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I understood what justice actually meant. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't watching my parents suffer. Justice was freedom. Freedom from guilt. Freedom from begging for love. Freedom from believing my worth depended on sacrifice. I drove toward Sophie's apartment, smiling softly to myself. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw her standing in the window, waving excitedly beside Nathan. Home. Not the house I grew up in. This, the life we built ourselves. I turned off the engine, grabbed the lasagna from the passenger seat, and walked inside without looking back.